my name is Caitlin Love, and today I'm going to show you my pitch presentation for a hybrid animated short film called I'm Sorry. I want to do a piece on the phrase I've heard so much in the last few months, the meaning, the emptiness, the resounding loneliness left when it's said, the suffocation of the words I'm sorry being forced down your throat to accept. When someone says I'm sorry, you feel a duty to respond, and as British culture has brought me up to do, I always replied with a measly, it's fine, or it's okay. But how can it be okay when my mother is dying? My concept is based upon my own personal life experience these past months, focusing specifically on the phrase I'm sorry, something I've heard so often that the word's meaning completely changes. My piece has 7 scenes as 7 letters in the phrase I'm sorry. Each scene is based on an important event. I will be using motion capture to rotoscope my protagonist, as my main character's face will be scribbled out or blurred, and I will be focusing more specifically on small body movements, so the rotoscoping will be used to capture a more realistic human movement, and I will also be using stop motion and claymation for my opening and transition scenes, using black polymer clay on a small wooden board to spell out the words I'm sorry, and then for transition scenes I will have the letters fall and flood the screen. And finally, it will be primarily 2D animated, with some 3D VFX effects on some scenes to highlight my own feelings of dissociation from the real world and how the thoughts of the past, present and future were bombarding my mind. I want it to feel sad, empty and angry, mirroring my own emotions. The point of my piece is to show how the phrase I'm sorry loses meaning depending on who's saying it and the situation it applies to, and how language is just that, words, and we as people give words meaning. But also that when your reality flips and it feels like nothing matters anymore, that the word gets sewn into your mind, your daily activities, your thoughts and your dreams. Or at least in my case. And now on to my live action 2D hybrid mood board for inspiration. So here are some just classic examples of hybrid animations such as Space Jam, Cool World, Enchanted. Specifically examples like Mary Poppins and Bedknobs and Broomsticks. The examples of hybrid animation, for instance, Song of Sea, a deeply emotional animated film dealing with loss and grief. For instance, Song of Sea, made in 2014, a deeply emotional animated film dealing with loss and grief, which inspires my approach to symbolism in animation, the way that they blend folklore and raw human emotion. And then, for example, Mary Poppins and Bedknobs and Broomsticks, examples of hybrid animation that use fantasy to explore deep emotions, similar to how my film uses animation to convey grief and detachment. And then also Space Jam. I take inspiration from Space Jam, specifically the technique of how the animation can be layered over live action to create surreal effects. And I will be taking this sort of inspiration within each sort of scene, adding the VFX effects over my 2D backgrounds. And then this is my mood board for inspiration for stop motion / live action. For example, I've picked James and the Giant Peach as the blend of stop motion and live action, and also the dreamlike quality is quite similar to how my animation will shift between different styles to reflect association. And then Where the Wild Things Are uses a mix of live action and practical effects to depict a child's emotions through surreal storytelling. The melancholic tone and theme of coping with complex emotions relates to my film's portrayal of sorrow and detachment. And then my final mood board for inspiration on films are fully rotoscoped films. For example, Scanner Darkly uses rotoscoping to create a surreal and dissociative atmosphere which aligns with my idea of feeling detached from reality. It also uses animation to blur the lines between reality and perception, which completely fits with my themes of overwhelming grief and existential questioning, as well as not necessarily knowing or feeling like anything is real due to the shock. And Undone, another sort of rotoscoped film in my area of grief. It mostly focuses on grief, time and memory, and the animation mirrors how past, present and future blend together, which is the exact same as in my narrative. It's also focused on body language and subtle expressions, massively have inspired my piece to be more focused on that, and highlight those very, very simple but loud movements. So for my software I will be using a range, quite a vast range, a lot of Adobe Creative Cloud. For example, Adobe Animate I will be using to rotoscope keyframes and also edit animation cycles and import them from Procreate. And then I'll be using Adobe After Effects to implement visual effects as well as composite 2D with my live action scenes and backgrounds. I will then use Premiere Pro to combine all animated and live action scenes and then also work on pacing, possibly colour grading to match with certain scenes and themes and moods. Also music synchronization, so I will be having a instrumental background sort of music playing, and in key heightened moments of tension I will be doing some colour grading. And Procreate is where I'll be doing most of my drawing, and I'll be producing backgrounds, concept art, and all the animation cycles for Animate. I will be using Unreal Engine to render and composite 3D environments with my live action footage, and also find 3D objects to merge with my 2D backgrounds, to emphasise further the feeling of dissociation from reality and not really understanding what's real and what's fake. I will be using OptiTrack to capture realistic human movement motion data, and then feeding that into Unreal Engine to edit, and then feeding that back into Adobe Animate to then rotoscope over those small movements. And finally, I will be using YouTube to source all my tutorials, as well as for publishing my hybrid short film. My art style is surrealism. So surrealism is mostly dreamlike, illogical imagery that tends to explore deep emotions, hidden truths, and distorted reality, often blending realism with abstract or fantastical elements to challenge perception, which aligns very closely with my concept. My film embraces surrealist techniques through visual distortion, shifting animation styles, and symbolic imagery to reflect the overwhelming nature of grief. My protagonist's face is blurred out, is mostly done to have sort of a universal feel, as in it can be relatable, and it's not my protagonist isn't put in a box. The protagonist's blurred out face, melting words, and reality blending transitions mirror the dissociation, emotional weight, and reality bending transitions mirror the dissociation and emotional weight of hearing "I'm sorry" repeatedly. The stop motion claymation sequences also add a tactile, handcrafted quality, emphasizing the imperfection and fragility of memory and emotion. My genre is a hybrid animated short film, as it blends multiple animation techniques, rotoscoping, stop motion, 2D animation, 3D, and VFX effects, to visually express complex emotions and associations. And the hybrid approach allows each animation style to represent the different layers of reality. For example, the stop motion represents the physical weight of words, as the "I'm sorry" calls and floods the screen. Rotoscoping captures the realistic human movement and subtle body language, focusing on grief and emotional suppression. And the 2D animation with 3D VFX adds surreal distortion, making memories and emotions feel fluid, fragmented, and overwhelming. I made my animation a hybrid to enhance its emotional depth, making it unique and also an immersive experience that blends reality with a dreamlike surrealism. And my target audience is 16+. My short film was intended for audience age 16 and above, aligning with the PEGI 16 rating, which allows for mature themes such as grief, emotional distress, and loss, as long as they are handled with artistic intent rather than excessive realism. For emotional themes, the film does deal with death, illness, and psychological distress, and topics may be too heavy for younger audiences, but I believe will be suitable for older teens and adults, hence being 16+. There is a brief scene involving a cigarette, however, it is presented subtly as a part of an emotional exchange rather than prompting smoking, and this keeps it within the PEGI 16 guidelines. There is also no graphic violence or horror. Even though the film remains psychologically intense rather than graphically disturbing, it still does fit the rating standards. And here is my first mind map that sort of just focuses on the entire idea. I'm sorry. So target audience just covered, but to go into more depth, it's viewers who have experienced significant loss or emotional isolation, animation students, possibly indie filmmakers and those interested in creative storytelling, and those interested in experimental storytelling, as it's a hybrid animation. Sound and design, I'm planning to have layered voices overlapping for saying "I'm sorry", and these voices will create an overwhelming soundscape. I will be having sort of instrumental music, as I'm collaborating with a musician for background music, and that will have highs and lows synchronizing to the animation at the time. I will also be using silence occasionally for key emotional beats to create tension and impact, and occasionally distorting dialogue, well, not dialogue, I'm not going to have any dialogue. Actually, no, yes, I will be and I'll be distorting this. And I will be distorting the phrase "I'm sorry" and have echo effects to really emphasize the protagonist's association from the world. Themes and messages, so The meaningless of I'm sorry is a very prevalent theme, the repetition of apologies that offer no real comfort or change, memory and time, the non-linear storytelling showing how grief blends past and present together, grief and emotional isolation, exploring how loss distorts perception and leaves individuals feeling disconnected, mental and emotional exhaustion, portraying how heavy loss strains a person emotionally, physically, and even spiritually, and then unspoken connections, the silent exchange of emotions between loved ones through meaningful actions rather than explicit dialogue. For aesthetic and visual style, I will be having some glitching and smearing, used to depict shock, emotional overload, or a detachment from reality, some soft lighting and shadows for more of a dreamlike lighting, and for memories, harsh contrast of white blinding sterile light for hospital settings, and a muted palette, more cold, desaturated tones for present and grief, and warm nostalgic tones in memory sequences. And my second mind map focuses solely on the music. So I would want the mood and tone to be sad and haunting, dissociative and dreamlike, touching and soft, angry and chaotic, sort of those main emotions. So key scenes and music moments, for example, the final scene where the mother in this protagonist says I'm sorry, the silence, then a single soft piano note into fading strings, opening sequence with the claymation. I'm not too certain, I was thinking maybe some piano, but also I'm sort of going to be leaving it up to the musician that I'm collaborating with, and I will be using instruments such as piano, strings for sort of climaxes, and distorted synths and reverse sounds for scenes such as the birthday where memories are a bit hazy, and to emphasize just the detachment from reality. On to my storyboard. So the first scene, we find out something is wrong with my mum, and I'm calling up all my friends, and all they're able to really say is I'm sorry. Now for this scene, I was thinking of having the sorries that I've said sort of echo out of the phone, maybe even have it just as writing just falling above, just in different fonts and sizing. Second scene, we find out that my mum has brain cancer, stage 4, and life is flipped. The doctors tell us Second scene, we find out that my mum has Second scene, we find out that my mum has brain cancer, stage 4. Life is flipped. The doctors tell us sorry. However, that sorry doesn't really get through, but there's that sorry again. And then the third scene, S, I have to tell everyone else in my mum's life. For example, her best friends, her sister, her work. And we get some sorries here and there, but it's all sort of drowned out by the horrificness of the situation. Fourth scene, my boyfriend rolls me a cigarette whilst I bury my head in memes, and it's sort of a silent exchange of sorry, even though it's neither of our faults, and there's just nothing you can do in that situation except for share a moment of appreciation for each other. Fifth scene, we're visiting my mum daily, but she won't stop telling me she's sorry. She doesn't understand why she's in the hospital and believes she can be cured. So this sorry again, and even though it is coming from a person I truly do care about in the situation, the lack of understanding of why the sorry is being said causes it to lose all meaning. Sixth scene, my birthday, filled with memories of my mum. She used to make me a cake every year. She always put in effort. She would make me my favourite dinner and breakfast, and yep, so that scene I'm going to have memories popping up and floating. That's where the nostalgic sort of warm tones will be coming in, but also the actual scene itself will be quite muted in colour. And seventh scene, why my mum was back home from hospital after finishing her first week of chemo. She's more aware and she understands she's dying, and she looks me dead in the eyes and says I'm sorry. And this is truly the only sorry that ever gets through to me during this moment in my life, and it's the only sorry that actually matters. Okay, and on to my abstract art influence mood board. So here we have the scream. This painting captures the raw, unfiltered existential dread and emotional pain. The swirling, distorted backgrounds inspire my film where reality bends and grief takes hold as life melts, and the visual distortion represents the overwhelming emotion. And I will be using swirling backgrounds, exaggerated expressions, and sharp contrasts to emphasize this grief. Guernica by Pablo Picasso. This painting uses stark black and white tones and chaotic composition to depict suffering, and my stop motion claymation sequence will actually mirror this using stark contrasts and fractured imagery to highlight emotional devastation. Particularly, we will focus on dissociation, time, and memory, connecting to the feeling of losing grasp on reality, blending past, present, future, and the repetition of I'm sorry. And then The Persistence of Memory by Salvador Dali. The melting clock symbolizes the distortion of time, much like how my protagonist's world warps under grief, and I will be using inspiration from that, such as slow motion, melting visuals, and warping animation effects to emphasize association. And now onto my faceless inspiration / main character design mood board. So here we have some pictures, most of them with blurred or scribbled out faces. For example, Doctor Who Season 2 Episode 7, The Idiot's Lantern. There we have The Son of Man by Rene Magritte, a man with his face hidden by an apple, and this symbolises identity and hidden truths, and this relates to my protagonist's scribbled out / blurry face, representing emotional detachment and the struggle to process grief. The obscured identity shows emotional suppression. I'm also inspired by The Lovers and The Son of Man, as they keep the protagonist's face blurred or scribbled and covered to show internal isolation. Another image here is from Hannibal Season 1 Episode 10, Will's Descent into Madness, where Will had advanced encephalitis, which is why he suffered from hallucinations, the loss of time and disorientation, which often caused faces to be blurred, which is also sort of similar, not to the same extent, but obviously similar to how I want my film to look. And here we have my mood boards for each scene. So the silent support mood board, I have my colour palette, and the first shock, where there will be mostly holographic effects coming out of the phone to really emphasise just how lost in my phone I am, even though I'm not truly lost in it, but just trying to escape, and the desperate need for escape. And then my third mood board will be telling others, and I've got my palette for that again, and that will mostly be just sitting in the car, but I'll be using effects on certain bright lights to make things appear more tense on certain body movements. Then the next one, the birthday, and this one is actually the images, the first two images are from the actual restaurant that I went to on my birthday. As you can see, it is quite plain and works very well with the muted colour scheme and also how I was feeling at the time. Dull and boring. And then my final mood board, the diagnosis / a mother's confusion, which will both be held in a hospital sort of setting. And here I'll have the classic NHS blue, maybe slightly off to avoid copyright, so a few shades down, but still nonetheless very similar. And then here is my experimental work. I was using OptiTrack, and I had one of my classmates get in the suit, and we were feeding it into real time on Unreal Engine. We just did some basic movements to see how the character flowed, and just up and down. And this was more experimental work I did earlier on before we had access to the OptiTrack equipment. I used an app on my phone called Move One, which allows you to do motion capture on your phone. So I got two of my other classmates to set up the phone and at the time just do some very extreme dance movements, and the other one I believe was a backbend, just to test and see the levels of which the motion capture would capture and track the body. And here are some of my developmental work. So the I'm Sorry is resonant of how I will be doing the claymation, sort of falling and dispersing, but I will also be having it flood back up to fill the screen. And here I have the basic idea of drawing for the car scene, just very simple 2D. Here is more advanced work for the hospital, which I'm going for more of a realistic approach in drawing. It's not finished yet, but quite clearly, but I have made a start on it, and I'm going for more of a realistic design on that, just so I have these conflicting art styles, and there's just not one solid theme throughout with either art style or emotion, just to highlight how volatile everything was during this time. And on to my unique selling points. So, emotionally impactful, as my film is not just a story, it is a real life story, and I tend to make it an emotionally immersive experience as it delves into grief, loss, the weight of words, and hopefully resonating deeply with audiences who have faced similar struggles. I find when anything bad happens, the first thing someone will say to you is, "I'm so sorry," or "I'm sorry." Also focusing on subtle human emotions such as body language, silence, and dissociation. The film captures raw and unfiltered feelings, making it deeply relatable and cathartic for viewers, I'm hoping. And the phrase "I'm sorry" and how it loses meaning over time. This will reflect how people process grief and communication differently, adding a layer of psychological depth to the narrative. My second unique selling point is based on real life, as it's deeply personal. It's inspired by my own lived experiences with grief, and hopefully has a level of authenticity that cannot be fabricated. Unlike fictional stories of loss, my piece captures real emotional nuances, things that I felt at the time, and have been able to work through, and hopefully can help others not feel alone. And the specific experiences of hospital visits, conversations, birthdays tainted by loss, and just, I feel, stories that can be quite relatable to others. My third unique selling point is a collaboration with a musician, as the soundtrack will play a crucial role in amplifying the emotional weight of my film, blending haunting, melancholic tones with moments of silence to emphasize association and sorrow. And by working with a musician to create an original source, the film will have a unique, tailored soundscape rather than relying on generic or stock music. Music will be used diegetically and non-diegetically, perhaps as a comforting presence in memories, distortive emotions, become overwhelming or entirely absent when words lose meaning. And finally, it is a hybrid animation, and by combining rotoscoping, stop motion, claymation, 2D animation, and 3D VFX effects, this film breaks traditional animation boundaries, offering a visually unique and experimental approach, and each animation style serves a symbolic purpose. For example, rotoscoping is the realistic movement emphasizing small emotional details. Stop motion represents the physical weight of words, with the "I'm sorry" crumbling and flooding the screen. The 2D animation allows for surreal distortions and visually depicts Agnes' mental state and just their detachment from reality. The 3D VFX effects enhances dissociative moments, making reality feel fragmented and overwhelming, and the mix of these techniques will hopefully make the film visually distinctive and emotionally powerful, ensuring it stands out in the world of short animated films. Okay, and my contingency plan. So in the case of data loss, I will be continuously having a backup routine, storing copies both on the OneDrive and also saving it to my own laptop at home, so I have multiple different versions. Also on Procreate, I will be continuously saving my work every time I go off it, actually. Or if I ever want to make a certain change that I'm not sure about, I will duplicate my work, and therefore I'll have multiple copies. Timeline delays. So there I do plan to do a lot in terms of animation, and there may be a chance that I don't necessarily complete it in time. And for that, regularly reviewing progress and adjusting my schedules as needed. I have a developed, detailed project timeline, and it does have buffer periods for timeline delays. And I've tried to get the stop motion and motion capture out of the way first, so that it won't be something I have to worry about further towards the deadline, and I can just add those bits in for Premiere Pro, and there's not much of a worry. And that's 2 out of the 4 animation techniques I'll be using, so at least I'll have those. For skill gaps, I will be watching a lot of tutorials on YouTube. I've found an extensive list to help me out with all different programs: Unreal Engine, Adobe After Effects, and I'm quite well acquainted with Adobe Animate and Premiere Pro. So I feel quite confident that I will be able to get what I need to be done and not have much trouble with this. And on to copyrights and consents. I have reached out to one of my old friends who is a musician and a producer, who has also worked under big artists such as Polyphia, and has gone to university for music and been in a band and done a lot of extra little courses. And they are happy to help me out, which is great, so that gets rid of any music issues I'd have to worry about. For sound effects, such as the layered I'm sorry's, I will be using my friends and my own voices, so there are no issues with that either. And then some feedback I got from my classmates was that they like the rotoscoping technique because of the topic, and they feel that it will make it more personal, as you can visually see someone hurting in the small body movements. And they also thought that the sound effects of my concept are important, as it contributes to how the viewer feels, and that I should spend quite a lot of time on them to make sure that they are accurate. And now my action plans. So week 1 was mostly research and pre-production planning, gathering references and finalising story structure and making a storyboard. Week 2 was initial animation and motion capture testing, finalising characters and environment design, setting up the OptiTrack motion capture and testing simple character movements. And then week 3, stop motion production and animation creation, shoot final stop motion sequence for the I'm sorry transition, and begin figuring out length and start blending scenes. Week 4, motion capture and recording and initial animation, record final motion capture data for protagonist movements, clean and refine motion capture data before importing to Unreal Engine, and begin rotoscoping and Procreate/animate based on motion capture footage. And then start creating 2D backgrounds for animated scenes. And week 5, 2D animation and scene composition, continue rotoscoping animation, refine stop motion transition effects, integrate 2D characters into live action and stop motion sequences. Week 6, VFX and experimental scene testing, implement VFX distortions and typography effects, so the sorry sequence of the overlaying on the phone, experiment with the holographic styles, with the cat memes popping out of the phone, and refine camera transitions and how the blend of animation styles work in Premiere Pro. And then the half term, I will be refining animation, editing, finalising rotoscope scenes and cleaning out my animation, adding final touches and lighting in Unreal Engine, and start editing complete scenes together. And then half term, sound design and post-production, working on sound design and the music syncing up on Premiere Pro, refining scene transitions and effects that match sound cues, and getting fair feedback on my emotional impact and how clear my animation story is. Week 9, final editing and rendering, double check technical details, frame rate, resolution, audio sync, export final animation in multiple formats for presentation, so a video on YouTube published as well as just a backup for me, and prepare a short explanation video discussing creative process and get more peer feedback. And then finally, week 10, project submission and presentation, have all my files gathered and organised in a OneDrive folder, and my final review in Adobe Pro and Unreal Engine. And finally, these are my Harvard references. Thank you so much.